97.3 ESPN.com Sixers Insider. Coming in for a landing is the podcast. Make sure you guys check that out, subscribe, and listen to the podcast for more great Sixers insight and analysis. And he joins us right now on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Sixers Jazz tonight. Now, the last time they played, this was a math problem, Paul. It was threes are better than twos, essentially. Do you anticipate that kind of matchup again tonight?
I would hope not, for the Sixers' sake. Although we did see the other night, I think it was New Orleans, I took way less threes than the Jazz and somehow beat them. It's not necessarily a method for success in the modern NBA. And as we saw in that last matchup, I think with Joel Embiid back, and then even recently you've seen, that West Coast trip was kind of funny in that the Sixers didn't take a lot of threes at any point in any of those games. But the last couple of games, you've seen an uptick. Joel Embiid has even said it, that he thinks the team needs to take more. And I think last game was a really good example of what happens when you do. And you saw the advantage they had over the Pacers in that game. So I would expect it. Listen, the Jazz are ridiculous. They take a ton, they make a ton. So they probably will have an advantage. That's just the way the season has played out. But I don't expect the disparity that we saw in Utah. No, I definitely don't.
Well, one thing is for sure. What do we make of this game if Tobias Harris doesn't play? That he had 36 the last time they played. How does that change the dynamic of what you get or what you take away from this game tonight?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that, Ben Simmons was so brilliant in Utah took away from the fact that Tobias Harris is almost equally as brilliant. Like you said, 36 points, and he was just great in that game. Utah really didn't have an answer for him. He got to his spots on the floor, made all of his mid-range jumpers, was making his three. He just had a great night. So it's tough because, and even that last matchup, it's so hard because Embiid didn't play and the Jazz didn't have Connolly. So right now, the Jazz are coming at you at full strength, pretty much. And so you're seeing them. And so Tobias Harris doesn't play. It's a big hit. I mean, it's 20 points a game you're taking off the table right there. And then it's another option. I think the one thing that Joel Embiid talked about after the Cavaliers game, which I thought was an excellent point, and maybe the way they missed Tobias Harris the most, is the fourth quarter, because it's so easy to double Joel Embiid in the fourth quarter, and then you're really daring all the Sixers to make shots. You're daring Ben Simmons to get to the rim, and it's just it's putting a lot on Embiid's shoulders. But when you have Tobias Harris out there, you can run that pick and roll to him. You saw the big shots he's hit throughout the season, how big he's been in fourth quarters. He hit the big shot obviously against the Lakers to win it, and he's hit several big shots like that and had many big fourth quarters. So I think that's where the matchup's going to get interesting. I think it's going to be close through three quarters, but in that fourth quarter, if Tobias Harris doesn't play, where do the Sixers go if they're going to really aggressively double team Joel Embiid? So, you could take a little bit, but I think it's not a be all end all. Like you can't, if the Sixers get blown out, that's one thing. But if it's a close game without Tobias Harris, I think it says a lot more about how good the Sixers are as opposed to maybe, how that matchup would really go. Maybe, let's say a championship preview or whatever.
Yeah, well, and when you're back on Friday's show, we will be at the halfway point. If the Sixers win tonight, they will be the number one seed at the midway point of the season. The Jazz will be the number one seed at the midway point. You got two teams that are the number one in the East versus number one in the West, and it doesn't feel like there's as much buzz about the two number one teams playing. I mean, heck, they're putting Brooklyn up against the second worst team in the West. Now, we know why that is, but I think both these teams feel a little bit like no one's kind of taking them seriously.
For sure. I would say, especially in the Jazz's case, I mean, they have the best record in the NBA easily. And they're playing great basketball. And like I said, like I alluded to earlier, they're playing the modern NBA, the way the game has gone. What did the Warriors do like during their runs? They hit threes and they played really good defense.
Yeah.
And that's what the Jazz are doing right now.
Well, I don't think people realize, Paul, Clarkson's been amazing for this team. Then they have these little, like Ingles can shoot it. O'Neal can shoot it. They've got a defensive guy in the middle who's a defensive player of the year. And Mitchell, who I said this earlier, see what you think. Mitchell, to me, he's not the best player on the team that wins the championship. He's like Kyrie Irving level. He's like Kyrie on the Celtics. Like, I'm good enough to get you to the number one seed, but probably, and I think that's why they're not the favorite.
Yeah, I mean, and that's fair. And then not only, like, you just look at the Western Conference. I mean, you have the Lakers and you have the Clippers. You have teams with MVP caliber players, guys that have won championships, guys that have won finals MVPs. So, I mean, it's really difficult to want to go all in on and I get it. It's difficult to want to go all in on the Jazz because you haven't seen that playoff success from them. To your point, you haven't seen Donovan Mitchell. I mean, he was pretty darn good in the playoffs last year, but you haven't seen him kind of carry the team and advance them. So I think that's probably where the quote unquote disrespect comes from. And then the Sixers case too. I mean, Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons, the farthest they've gotten is the second round of the playoffs. They haven't been able to get to the Eastern Conference Finals. So I think for both of those teams, there's a lot of, yeah, this is nice. You guys look really good, but let's see what happens when it gets to the playoffs. But I just think, Mike, to your point, the Jazz, I mean, there's just so many guys that people don't realize kind of how good they are. Mike Conley is like one of the most underrated players of his generation. I mean, he's never going to make an all-star team, but he has been an all-star caliber player for, over a decade. And I think the one thing they have, when you look at like just the matchup with them and the Sixers and what the Sixers would kill to have, Donovan Mitchell can create his own offense. Mike Conley can create his own offense. Jordan Clarkson can create his own offense. The Sixers would kill for one guy like that can do it at that level. So I think that's the one thing that separates maybe the Jazz from some other teams. Yes, they shoot threes well. Yes, they play defense very well, but they also have shot creators, and that's huge in the playoffs.
All right, so with that, we talk about shot creators and needing more offense. Let's have Paul Hudrick break down this trade right here, which we're all talking about Lowry. We're all trying to find up creative ways. What about this deal here? The Sixers get Lowry, okay, but they're giving up Maxey, a first-round pick next year, a first-round pick protected in 2023, and then Green, Scott, Ferguson, and a second-round pick in a 3-team deal. They're giving up a bunch to get one guy back. So if that's the way a trade has to happen to get Kyle Lowry, break down this trade, whether you like it or not. And then we have another one that was proposed by ESPN.com that I want to get your thoughts on. But obviously, this is the higher profile player, I guess. I mean, the other player would help this team a lot too, but this is the higher profile, Lowry. What do you think about this deal?
So it's a lot, flat out. It's a lot, but I trust the valuation. I trust a guy like Tim Bontemps, who's got sources within the league. That's who came up with that kind of scenario. So I trust that that's the valuation he's hearing that it's going to take, and it is a lot. But I think kind of like what we talked about last time, like I can't remember if it was the last time I was on or the time before that, this is not just an all-in and then you're depleted. If you make this, the best case scenario is you make this move and you win a championship and then you re-sign Kyle Lowry. That's the obvious best case scenario. Worst case scenario, you make this move, you don't win a championship, and you don't re-sign Kyle Lowry. If that's the case, you still have Joel Embiid, you still have Ben Simmons, you still have Tobias Harris, and then you have Daryl Morey with some cap space. So the worst case scenario isn't terrible. I think you make a move like this, and yes, I think it puts you and the Nets are right there. You and the Nets are the favorites to match up in the Eastern Conference Finals, to me at least, if you make this deal. And I don't think and listen, I love Tyrese Maxey, Mike. I love Tyrese. I love him from the moment they drafted him. I love this kid, and I think he's going to be a very good NBA player. But this move could make you the team that comes out of the Eastern Conference to make it to the NBA Finals. Right now, as you sit, I don't know that you are that team. But if you make this trade, you will have to be considered one of, if not the favorite to come out of the East. So to me, it's tough. It's a lot, but I would pull the trigger on this. I really would.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the prior conversations we've all had, it was players, but first-round pick next year and then another first-round pick 2 years from now. Now, I don't mind giving up first-round picks if I think I'm going to be a good team. I'm getting picks in the 20s who typically don't translate to serviceable NBA guys. You're just taking their crapshoot players. So I don't mind that. It's just, you're giving up Maxey, 2 first-round picks, then Green, then Scott. Ferguson obviously doesn't do much, but next thing I know, I'm now losing you're losing 3 guys, 2 of which are kind of in your rotation. Green, obviously. Scott, I guess. How do you feel, Scott? You just wrote an article about Scott. Where do you see him moving forward?
So listen, I like Mike Scott. I think, 2 years ago, what I wrote in that piece was 2 years ago, this guy was critical. We shot over 40% when he arrived here from the Clippers. When you looked at that bench, Brett Brown could only trust 2 guys, James Ennis and Mike Scott. Those are the only 2 players he could trust off that bench. Mike Scott played through plantar fasciitis in his foot. Listen, he had a bad year last year. He would tell you that. He was not very good last year. This year he's been banged up. He couldn't stay on the court. He's been, both of his knees have given him issues. But I think what you saw in that Pacers game is what he can be. Listen, not a starter, but off the bench, a guy that can hit an open shot. He does a lot of little things that you need. You need little thing, like you have the big guns. You need little things, guys, too. You need someone who's not afraid to be physical, someone who's not afraid to get in another player's face, who will go toe-to-toe with Miles Turner or another kind of big guy, and then also be able to guard TJ McConnell in the same game, that versatility. You need guys like that. With that said, he's not a guy that I'm like, if that's the deal to get Kyle Lowry, then okay. Like, you're not going to hold back Mike Scott just because, like, you know what I mean? To make that deal. But at the same time, he is also a guy there are players you can replace him with. Again, if you make this deal, you still have a trade exception around $8 million. You still have the taxpayer mid-level exception for buyout guys. Maybe you swing a deal for a PJ Tucker, and then after that, Mike Scott who? Because PJ Tucker does that role, but at a much higher, with all due respect to Mike Scott, at a much higher level. So again, this Lowry trade does not preclude you from doing from making other moves to upgrade your bench. And then two, it doesn't deplete you for the future where your hands are tied and you can't do anything in the offseason, because that's just not the case.
Yeah, you would be giving up Maxey, Green, Ferguson, and Scott, 4 players of which really 1.5 are in the full-time. Maxey is not really in the full-time rotation. Ferguson is completely not in the rotation, which I don't know why. Ferguson's a nice little player. I guess Thibault's kind of ahead of him, and they use Korkmaz, instead. So, all right, here's the other trade that has been proposed, and it has to do with the Sixers getting Lou Williams here. So they would get Lou Williams and Mike Muscala, who is the reason the Sixers have Maxey. They would just be giving up Terrence Ferguson, Tony Bradley, Mike Scott, and a first-round pick. So would you rather go that kind of route? You're not giving up nearly as much, and you're getting a player like Lou Williams.
I don't know about rather, but I would if the Lowry thing proves to be too rich or just doesn't work out. Maybe Toronto changes its mind. Maybe Lowry changes his mind, decides he wants to stay in Toronto. This is a strong alternative. You get Lou Williams, who you can either start or bring off your bench. You still have Danny Green, so you can just pretty much roll with your same starting lineup. You have Lou Williams and Shake Milton, 2 pretty dynamic guards you could bring off your bench all of a sudden. That makes you more dangerous. Mike Muscala is a fine stretch 5 option. If there is a matchup that Dwight Howard is really struggling with, maybe a more mobile center, you could go to Mike Muscala and he can maybe stretch the floor a little bit and play that kind of role. So I don't mind it. First round pick, it's still a pretty significant, price to pay. But yeah, I mean, I would certainly consider if the Lowry thing is off the table, you get Lou Williams and Mike Muscala. That's upgrades. Those are 2 players that can help you.
Yeah. Well, Muscala would basically, I guess, turn into the backup stretch 4 that you're looking for, and Scott has we're hoping can do that. Bradley doesn't play a lick. Ferguson doesn't play a lick. You're giving up a first-round pick that you're hoping is 28th, 29th, 30, maybe even deeper, and you're getting Lou Williams back. So, I mean, I can't – this one doesn't really – I have no hesitation with this one. I have minimal hesitation with the Lowry one. I do them both.
I'm probably on the same page with you. The Lowry one would sting, but I would still probably do it. Whereas the Williams one, I could definitely move on, because you're still with the Lowry one, you're keeping all of your young players, with the Lou Williams one, you're keeping all of your young players. And like you said, you're only giving up a first round pick that's probably not going to be a very good pick. So you could certainly swallow that. And Lou Williams, a guy who can create his own shot. And then also too, Mike, the other thing to consider is when you get to the playoffs, you're not going to need would Mike Scott have even played, because you have 2 guys who kind of play that, you have Tobias Harris, who is going to play 40 plus minutes a night. And then you have Ben Simmons, who's going to probably play some minutes at the 4 as well. So that's the other thing, is your rotation is going to shrink pretty significantly when you get there. So, that stretch 4 role doesn't become as prevalent unless you get a player that just is so good. Again, like a PJ Tucker, because he's so good, you want him out there. You don't need necessarily that stretch 4 guy, if that makes sense. So I think that's another thing to factor in.
And I brought this. I don't know what you think about Oladipo. See, Oladipo doesn't shoot it all that well, but he can get a bucket. I would almost like to see him play with the second unit so him and Shake could play together. But Lou Williams would almost – I would like to see Shake and Lou Williams. I had the conversation with you. It's not that I don't like Shake. It's just, some nights he's going to give me 25 and some nights he's going to get me 4. And that's just the inconsistencies of being a 24-year-old guy learning his way. Lou Williams, I know, is getting me 15. Whether he's starting, coming off the bench, playing 5 minutes, 35 minutes, he's going to be – I know I can get points from him. And if I have Shake and Lou playing together off the bench, I feel pretty good all of a sudden. But Oladipo, I don't think would really accept that role. You got to give up a lot to get him, and then he probably bolts.
Yeah, see, that would be for me. I would want to know the price tag for Oladipo. I would be interested if the price tag is like, I don't know, because they got essentially the Rockets got him from the Pacers. The Pacers received a second rounder in Karis LeVert. So what
I would have taken LeVert.
Well, sure, LeVert would have been a nice guy to have, absolutely. But I think Oladipo would fit really well so in a deal you'd have to move Danny Green, most likely to get him. So he's going to be your starter at that point. So he'd be your starting two guard.
Right. He's $21 million, by the way. So he's a lot.
Yes.
You have to give up a lot less to get him in terms of just contracts.
Correct. Yeah. But you think of it like in terms of this, you plug him in. I think he's a defensive upgrade from Danny Green personally. When he was at his peak, he was one of the better two-way guards in the league. And I think his ability to create, his ability in the pick and roll. I love the idea of him and Ben Simmons in the pick and roll. You talked about the shot, and I hear he has not shot the ball well in Houston. But look at that Houston roster, man. I mean, there's nowhere to go.
Even in his best year in Indiana, I mean, he was like 36, 37. He's not the guy that you're hoping.
That's Kyle Lowry. Kyle Lowry, I mean, he's had a couple years where he's been closer to 40, but that's pretty much his career average is right around that too. Not to say, listen, Kyle Lowry is a better player than Victor Oladipo right now. Yes, 100%. But I'm just saying, if you're looking at just from that standpoint of a shooter, him and Oladipo, I don't think are that there's not that big of a disparity as far as a reliable knockdown shooter. I would say you get a little more size with Oladipo as you would with Lowry, obviously, even though Lowry does play much taller than 6 foot. But no, I think Oladipo, and to your point about you could stagger Oladipo and Ben Simmons so that Oladipo and Shake Milton are still kind of leading that second unit, but Oladipo is your starter. So I think there are ways to get creative and do that. And then to me, that also takes care of your need because you don't really need that backup point guard in that sense. Because if you have two of Ben Simmons, Oladipo, and Shake Milton on the floor at all times, you really don't need a George Hill or a guy like that, like a veteran backup point guard. And the same would stand if you got a Lowry. You wouldn't need that guy because
Lou Williams. I mean, Lou Williams can handle the ball too. So all three of these guys make sense. They all have different levels of value you need to give up to get them. So the question is Kyle Lowry and what you have to give up to get him that much better than the lowest option of Lou Williams and what you need to give up to get him? And I feel that Lou Williams kind of fits what I need for less price.
I would agree, but I just think that Kyle Lowry, I would say that Kyle,
does that add another level? Does that add another layer or level of ceiling on how far you can go?
Yes, I would say yes, because I think of it like this too, Mike. Let's say they get Kyle Lowry in there tomorrow, right? You probably don't start him and Seth Curry together as your starting backcourt just because that's small. You probably would put maybe Matisse Thybulle in there and think about that matchup against a team like the Nets in a playoff series. Lowry gets Kyrie Irving, Matisse gets James Harden, Ben Simmons gets Durant. Now listen, they are 3 great offensive players. They are going to get theirs. But when you think about how other teams can match up against them, is there a team that could possibly match up better than that trio?
Right.
I don't think there is in the league. So when I think of it like that, and listen, you don't want to make deals just because of one team, but let's be realistic. The Nets are that team that you're at some point likely going to have to get through if you want to get to the finals. So having the ability to match up with them would be huge. So to me, yeah, like if you left things as they are, Mike, and let's say you get a Lou Williams and you bring him off the bench, no doubt you are a better team. You have upgraded significantly to me, no doubt about it. But against the Nets, then you're starting Seth Curry probably on Kyrie Irving. Danny Green is going against James Harden and Ben Simmons against Durant. it's, I just think that would elevate that matchup so much more if you were able to get a Kyle Lowry. And I just think Lowry, championship guy, man. He's won a championship. He's tough as hell. He's a bulldog. And just the way I think he would bring those, on top of the skill he has, those intangibles and just that leadership and that toughness, I think would be a great asset.
Which was last week. I don't know if it was you on when we were talking about it, but if I could, and I know Morey has ties, I'd call Ariza. He can play defense. In that series, you have Ariza, Thibault, Simmons, Durant, Harden, Kyrie, and there you go. Like, not that Trevor Ariza is like, I don't know, he's a little older. I don't know if he's the same defensive player, but he was a pretty good defensive player in 2 years ago, and he was with the Rockets. Morey obviously knows him, and he's going to be a buyout guy here in a couple of weeks. So I think that's a name to keep an eye on, too, for the defensive purpose. Now, he might be a guy in the next series you don't use at all. But in that series, that's his role, and boom, you move forward. Good stuff. We could talk about this all day long. And obviously, with the Sixers hitting the break, we'll take a look at the Sixers at the midway point coming up tomorrow and Friday. Paul will be back on Friday. Make sure you check out Coming In for a Landing. Great podcast, great Sixers work from the guys over at 97.3 ESPN.com. All right, Paul, we'll talk to you Friday, man.
Sounds good, Mike.
All right, he, like all guests, appeared via the Boardwalk Honda hotline. And don't forget, Paul, Kevin, and Jay Blevins, all their Sixers work at 97.3 ESPN.com.